started to ask some serious questions about evolution.
Dr. Jerry Bergman is a walking paradox. Raised not only a convinced evolutionist, but also an atheist. He has 9 university degrees, 2 of them PhDs. He's listed in Marquis Who's Who in the Midwest since 1992, Marquis Who's Who in America since 2000, Marquis Who's Who in Education since the 6th edition, Marquis Who's Who in Science and Engineering since the 8th edition, Marquis Who's Who in Medicine and Healthcare since 2005, Who's Who in Theology and Science, Who's Who in America, 47th edition. His library is listed in the Directory of Special Libraries and Information Centers. October 29th, 2009, he was appointed Research Associate at Logos Research Foundation, Santa Ana, California. And he is a member of Mensa, the International High IQ Society. His story took a number of remarkable twists and turns as he applied his methodical and tenacious researching skills to the question of origins. I asked him what it was that started his journey of questions.
I questioned atheism because I was involved in the atheist movement. I looked in the literature, the atheist literature, and I became very discouraged with what I found because it just was not accurate. Like, for example, the Bruno case, the Galileo case, which is well known, as well as the Spanish Inquisition, etc.
Okay, now, I know that when I read the atheist literature now, I don't know what it was like back then, but I know now, you read the atheist literature, and they spend more time focusing on God than the Christians do.
Yeah.
They just love to hate this God they say doesn't exist. Now, did that play a role back then? Or not?
Partially. Also, I recognize that the atheists spent a lot of time complaining about the Christians, but didn't really spend much time doing what they thought the Christians should be doing. I knew of no atheist hospitals, no atheist clinics. I know most atheists were not involved in any charitable works. It seemed like their whole focus of atheists was lambasting Christians. And I wondered, if the world is such a bad place, why aren't they doing something to make it better? And I realized that many Christians were doing a great deal to make the world better, and the atheists, by and large, were not. They were, by and large, spending their time complaining about Christians. They also pushed the idea that if there were no Christians in the world, it would be a pretty nice place. And I thought that was naive. For example, they felt Christians were not always very loving, which is true, but many atheists were not at all loving in most ways, in many ways. For another example is that they felt there's a lot of evil in the world, which of course there is, and they felt that much of this evil was caused by Christians, but yet they were not doing the things necessary to reduce this evil. For example, building hospitals and clinics and charitable works and so on, that they spent most of their time criticizing Christians and very little time really trying to help out with the problems in the world. And Christians certainly have many faults. No one claims Christians are perfect, but on the other hand, there were many Christians that I knew that were doing a great deal to help other people, such as volunteering their time for hospitals, such as building hospitals, such as raising money for various charitable organizations, such as trying to help the poor in the neighborhood. And the churches I've been involved with have all been very concerned about helping the poor, doing what they can to alleviate suffering and pain and so on. And so I saw the atheists as a lot of complainers and really not doing much at all to help the world.
Okay, so there was errors in the claims and in the ways of the atheist movement, but that wasn't, to focus in on what we're looking at here, that wasn't what made you question evolution though, right? So what was it, what was the straw that broke the camel's back there?
Wasn't one final thing, just the evidence accumulated until, as I put it, the dam broke. It just had overwhelming evidence, okay. And I went from evolution is true to it might not be true to it probably isn't true to it isn't true to there's no way it's true. It's simply not true at all. So my conviction started with a lot of doubt, and I ended up basically concluding that indeed evolution, it will not work, it does not work, it cannot work, and that's a result of science. That's not the result of religion or belief, it's the result of the scientific evidence. The scientific evidence is very clear, it did not occur and it could not occur, and I could only accept the scientific evidence, and therefore I went to where the evidence led, and that's where it led, and I could not conclude anything else. As Martin Luther said, here I stand, I can do no other. And I felt, here I stand, I can do no other, although it took a while to me to get to that point. Okay. Maybe I'm a slow learner, but some people, very quickly, they realize it's not viable. But on the other hand, my influence of my father and other people, my studies, my professors, was such where it was accepted by those around me. And so therefore it was part of my culture, it was part of my value system. And it was hard to overthrow this value because indeed this is what I accepted as true for some time. And therefore I had to be clear evidence because I didn't want to be, as they say, fooled again. Fooled once, fooled twice, you know, the problem. Fooled once, that's normal. But fooled twice, you have a problem. And so I wanted to make sure indeed the evidence was very clear before I dumped the Darwinian worldview. And it's a worldview. It's a way you look at the world. When I was an atheist, this is one thing that they stressed, that this is the means to bringing people to atheism. This is their proselytizing goal, their proselytizing key. And this is why if you look at the atheist literature, which I read religiously for many years, if you look at their literature, you realize that evolution is central and they know it. And there's hardly a piece of atheist literature that doesn't talk about evolution and the importance. So they know how important it is, and that's why they're so determined to fight the questioning of evolution, the creationists, intelligent design supporters, etc. Even theistic evolutionists, many are very opposed to because they feel that opens the door to theism, and which of course it does, but it opens the door to atheists becoming theists. And they realize that that's a major chunk of their armor, and so therefore they fight tenaciously to ensure that evolution holds sway in the schools, in society, in the media, etc.
Okay, so where did you start your explorations first? What did you question?
I just
first?
explored the whole issue. My goal was to look at the whole issue, and I took the evolution book that we used in college, and as well as a biology book, and I outlined the basic evidence for evolution, and I evaluated each individual topic separately. And the first topic I went into in detail was the question of vestigial organs.
Vestigial organs. You probably learned about those in high school. These are organs that are allegedly leftovers from our evolutionary past. Your appendix is an example. Originally believed to do nothing, the evolutionary community referred to it as an evolutionary leftover, an organ we inherited from our ape ancestry, which no longer serves a purpose. Now, since that time, however, it's been discovered that the appendix does have several purposes.
I thought that'd be an easy area to deal with because either these organs have a use, or they have a function, or they don't. And so I spent a great deal of time in the medical school looking in the literature, the scientific literature, the medical literature, to see whether or not the supposed 100 vestigial organs that were claimed to be such are indeed vestigial organs. And slowly but surely I eliminated one after the other organ until it became apparent that there are no vestigial organs in humans. Vestigial, by that, they usually mean an organ that has no function, or an organ now,
right.
The definition has changed a little bit in the past few years. It's more commonly felt to be an organ that had a different function, or a greater function in the past, and now it has less function. But with that definition, a problem is that most organs, or at least many organs in humans, could be classified as vestigial because many animals have sight, for example, better than ours, birds, or smell better than ours, dogs. And so therefore the concept of vestigial loses its meaning when you begin to extend it beyond the traditional 100 or so vestigial organs which have been claimed historically.
Okay, so you went from vestigial organs. Where did you go to from there?
After I pretty carefully researched vestigial organs, then I looked into other areas like the fossil record, which I'm still working on because there's a lot of animals out there. There's about 100 different species. There's a lot of plants. And there seemed to be some examples which were convincing at first, like human evolution. But as I researched more and more, it became apparent that these examples were not at all convincing. And it's an area I'm still looking into at this time. I looked at other areas such as natural selection. Mutations was a major area of interest, especially when I was at the medical school. We did a lot of research in the area of mutations because I was involved in cancer research, and of course cancer, we're talking about the accumulation of mutations. So cancer is a disease of the genes, and therefore mutations are of central importance. And in spending a fair amount of time looking at the mutational record, it was pretty apparent that indeed mutations does not tend to help evolution, it tends to hurt it. The vast majority of mutations are either neutral or near neutral. Actually, now we recognize they're near neutral or harmful, and therefore that was a concern. And also it became apparent that positive mutations, beneficial mutations were very, very rare, and often these had side effects which were more problematic than the gains that they got from mutations. So you climb up the mountain a foot and you go back down 3 feet. Mm-hmm. So there certainly are some positive mutations, but by and large most of these have side effects which are problematic, and therefore that was a concern that I looked into. And of course I always had an interest in molecular biology. I did a master's degree in that area at the medical school. I also was a research scientist at the medical school for a while.
You may recall one comment I received regarding the trailer for this documentary. Have these guys even heard of comparative genomics? Are they aware that they share thousands of pseudogenes, ERVs, and ALU elements in the same positions in their genomes as other species? Seeing as how genetics is one of Dr. Bergman's areas of expertise, and he has written on these very subjects in the technical literature, I think it's safe to say that the commenter has simply not done their homework. Dr. Bergman has already shown why the evolutionary claims regarding ERVs, ALU elements, junk DNA, etc. does not support evolution, and that comparative genomics is still highly subjective and, secondly, based on circular reasoning. Comparative genomics assumes the genomes from different species can even be compared to prove something about evolution because they come from a common ancestor. This assumption is problematic for several reasons, such as genetic mobile elements or hotspots. Such comparisons also disregard the stark differences between genomes.
And as a result of my working in the field and doing a great deal of reading in the field, it became apparent that mutations is not a viable means of producing a genetic variety that's necessary for evolution to work. The problem, of course, is not survival of the fittest. It's obvious an animal that's more fit is better able to survive. The problem has always been the arrival of the fittest. And this is a problem Darwin faced. By the way, he solved it by a number of creative ways. One, he looked at Lamarckian biology, which he accepted more and more as time went on. And also, he basically felt that there was an infinite amount of variety and variation among living organisms. And he felt that there was no need to produce new information, that within the organism there was already a great deal of information which evolution could work on. And we realized that there is a great deal of information, but there's not the information we need to evolve from as they say, the zoo, via the zoo, from the goo to you by way of the zoo.
Okay, you had written an article for Creation Research Society Quarterly, Darwinism and the Deterioration of the Genome, right in line with your expertise. And I mean, you were thorough in your search, that's for sure. I mean, you looked at, what, hundreds of thousands of articles in the technical literature looking for examples of beneficial mutations, specifically looking for examples of an increase in information caused by a beneficial mutation. And out of the hundreds of thousands, you found, what, 176 articles that actually specifically documented what was an alleged beneficial mutation?
I looked at the literature. We have a number of excellent data sources now, databases that we can do searches on, and I looked, number one, the number of mutations, and there's about 500,000 articles which talk about mutations in the literature. And then I looked at beneficial mutations, and I found 186 articles that talked about beneficial mutations. Then I looked at these articles and found that you could classify the beneficial mutations into groups. Most were beneficial in a very limited area, and many were beneficial only for humans. They were not beneficial for the animal. And of course, a classic example is seedless watermelon, seedless fruit, and so on, which is certainly not beneficial for the fruit, but it is very beneficial for humans who don't want to have to deal with seeds in their watermelon. And there are a number of other examples that were beneficial, but beneficial in a very limited area. I didn't come up with any mutation that would lend credibility to the idea of evolution via the accumulation of mutations. And that's basically what the theory of evolution now propounds today, that we are a result of the accumulation of beneficial mutations. In other words, we are the result of accumulation of mistakes. Mutations are mistakes. They're copying mistakes. When DNA makes a copy, sometimes a mistake occurs, and that is called a mutation. And so therefore they hypothesize that we indeed are the result of the accumulation of mistakes. And that alone, that phrase, illustrates the problems with Darwinism. So it's not survival of the fittest. It is the arrival of the fittest. And that's the problem that we still have to deal with today in the evolutionary world. Even though they've come up with a number of theories like orthogenesis and panspermia, etc., none of these have held water. All of the alternative theories they tried to propose, which explain the origin of new information, has not held scientific scrutiny. And so the only theory they have left now is mutations, which many biologists recognize as unsatisfactory. And so therefore they're still working on alternative sources of new variations. And my guess is eventually they're going to realize that there's no viable means you're going to have of producing new information, which is back to what the exact problem Darwin had. And he recognized he had this problem. And he tried to solve it by a number of ways. He developed an idea involving gemmules, where basically there was these seed-like small structures which would travel throughout the body and pick up genetic changes, or pick up changes, somatic changes actually, and then this would cause genetic changes, and these genetic changes then would be passed on to one's offspring. And this idea of pangenesis is what he called it, and using gemmules, gemmules was the carrier, and that idea didn't work out either, although he accepted that strongly for many years. But after research study showed it just was not viable, it did not work, he eventually became disillusioned with that idea as well.
Having multiple degrees in psychology, including a PhD, Dr. Bergman has written his analysis of Darwin's various psychoses, as well as more recent and infamous Darwin believers. You'll recall one viewer who wrote a long diatribe about how Hitler had creationist and Christian views, didn't accept evolution, and a rash of other erroneous claims. All this viewer demonstrated was that they had not done their homework. It just so happens that Dr. Bergman, himself Jewish by descent, has written extensively on the connection between the actions of Hitler and his men and their Darwinian views. Even secular scholars have written on these facts, connecting the very obvious dots between Hitler's evolutionary worldview and his actions. It's not the creationists who've been pointing out the connection. The producers of the movie Expelled, with host Ben Stein, himself also a Jew, were criticized by some for their suggesting a connection between evolutionary belief and the Holocaust, while others criticized the producers for not going far enough with this fact. Dr. Bergman already mentioned that evolution really is a worldview. We all have a worldview. The question is, which worldview is the correct worldview? While Allen never really rejected the idea that there was a God, he was soon to discover the effects his evolutionary worldview had upon his view of God.
My name's Alan Montgomery. I grew up in Victoria, BC. My father was a university professor, and my mother was a housewife. We were sort of generally middle-class family. I went to the University of Victoria, and I got a university degree, an honors degree in mathematics at the end of 1969. And I thought, you know, science was a very important part of society and a very important part of my future. I wanted to become a scientist. That was my chiefest goal in life, was become a good scientist. I came out of university convinced of the theory of evolution. Not that I'd studied it very, very deeply, but all the academic opinions were on that side. And of course, you know, knowledge being such an important thing, I just accepted their knowledge was true. Because I thought knowledge was so important, and I focused on it, I became quite arrogant towards those who had less knowledge and less education than I did.
So why did you become a Christian? What changed?
Well, I never really came to the point of concluding there was no God. I just ignored him.
Okay, so deep down, you already knew there was a God deep down.
Sort of, vaguely, back in the, you know, he was 5 billion years ago, you know, like he was 2,000 years ago and 5 billion light years away, you know.
Right.
It was like there in the background, like cosmic background radiation, you know. He's everywhere, but he's irrelevant.
But you did have a conversion experience, though, right?
I became a Christian in 1973. A Baptist moved into my apartment. I owned the apartment and I rented him a room, and he had Bible studies, etc. in my house, and that was fine. And he started inviting me to his church, and I was very reticent. You know, God was so far away, and 5 billion light years and 2,000 years ago. You know, he really didn't have much to do or say in the modern world, right? You know, but eventually he did persuade me to go to a meeting, and I went to one, and there was a British preacher named Barney Coon speaking, and instead of speaking on Jesus as Savior, which would have bored me to death, he spoke on the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And that was something I hadn't really heard out of the Bible, that Jesus was really sovereign over all the events of the world, and therefore, science and politics were just little subdivisions in his kingdom. And that sort of changed my spirit. It got to me on the inside that this was actually what I was looking for, someone significant in the universe who was actually doing something today, now. And so I confessed Jesus as Lord, and everything in my life changed radically. I read the New Testament in 3 days, couldn't get enough of it. It was just, and the truth was just liberating. It was just coming out of me all over the place. I couldn't stop reading it.
Okay, so at this point, you're a born-again believer, Christian, but you still believed in evolution.
Yes, I had no reason to throw science away. I mean, science was just part of God's kingdom, and therefore the science that said evolution was true was just part of, a little subdivision of God's kingdom. And so I was a theistic evolution. God caused evolution to bring all these things, the universe, the life, man into existence. I didn't see any contradiction there with what was in the scripture.
So in your mind, evolution was science?
Yes, of course.
Evolution and science were synonymous?
Well, I mean, what scientist was there that ever spoke against evolution? I'd never heard of any in my entire education. And I read quite widely on science, and I watched a lot of science programs, and not a single one of them ever doubted evolution. So that didn't seem to me that there was any grounds to doubt evolution.
Okay, you said you didn't really have a struggle. Walk me through the transition here.
Yeah, well, I was going along quite happily, and I had a friend, and we've gone out to the grocery store to buy some stuff. And he, as part of our conversation, sort of brought something up that sort of showed that, evolution wasn't true, and evidence that properly interpreted would support creation. And I dumped on him really badly. How can you possibly use Genesis to reject the sure-found conclusions of science? And I immediately came under conviction that I'd done something that upset God, big time. And so he apologized for upsetting me. It's kind of bad when you sin against somebody and they apologize for themselves. But that's how badly I had dumped on him. I had taken such offense at what he had said. And I went home that night knowing I had to deal with God, and I started praying to God and asked him, what exactly did I do wrong? Because I didn't understand what I'd just done. And God gave me the rebuke of my life. He said, how dare you look down your nose at somebody for whom I died? And I felt so small. It was a life-changing experience because there was no escape. There was nothing to do but surrender to that rebuke and to turn it into a life-changing experience where you start treating people even unbelievers, with the dignity of the knowledge, because you know that God died for them. You treat them with a special dignity that doesn't come from you, it comes from your knowledge of God. So I had to reverse my stand on how to respond to that challenge of science versus the Bible. And then when I started saying, but God, it's just science, God turned around and sort of said, well, who told you that? And the idea that evolution wasn't science came into my head, and it was like a blinding flash of light. And the only thing I could do with that was either to turn against God or surrender. God doesn't give you any choices. He doesn't let you sit on the fence. You're either for him or against him. And I was for him, right? And so I had nothing left to do but to surrender and start to consider that evolution really wasn't science. So then I went to the Christian bookstore, and the Holy Spirit tapped me on the shoulder and said, here, read this book. And it was Evolution, Possible or Impossible? And basically he looked at the probabilities and statistics of organizing life by random chance. And I'm a mathematician. I know what random chance is all about. And basically the whole point of the book is that in the Bible you have God miraculously creating the universe and creating life. And over here you have a bunch of scientists who, in complete defiance of all the probabilities and all the statistics, invoke a statistical miracle that defies the odds. And this made perfect sense to me as a mathematician. So the notion that life was some random chance event, or that mutations and random mutations could change one animal into another, went right out the window and into the garbage bin. So that sort of took care of that. But I still had a struggle with the age of the planet, the age of history, like the length of time of history, and what to do with fossil men and stuff like that. Well, fossil men really wasn't all that big a problem. You read Gish's book, Evolution, the fossils say no, and it's quite obvious that the fossils and evolution are, a patchwork of guesses.
Allen had gotten a hold of one of the landmark creation books, first published in 1972. The book laid out the case for several points. What we see in the fossil record is stasis and extinction. Organisms reproducing after their kind, exactly as the biblical account of creation shows, or extinction, which is a loss of variety, a loss of genetic information. Both of these points alone are the opposite of evolution. Gish also pointed out that the alleged fossil evidence for evolution is highly subjective at best, and the evolutionists themselves disagree with the interpretations. But even if you did have a fossil of an organism that looked like an intermediate fossil, say half human, half ape, what you really have evidence for is a dead thing. This is not proof of evolution, as we do not even know if that organism ever had any offspring. Furthermore, while we have apes today that can have remarkable human-like appearance, the differences between humans and apes reaches far beyond the major physical differences, like reproductive systems. For example, we do not see apes building rockets, sending each other to the moon, or doing mathematical calculations, writing books, or making paintings and other works of art. One such case of an alleged evolutionary sequence that struck Allen as he read was the alleged reptile-to-bird sequence. For example, most of the viewers will have heard the claim that dinosaurs have been found with feathers, which proves that birds evolved from dinosaurs. Actually, the truth is that most of the feathered dinosaurs were found with material that was interpreted to be proto-feathers, the precursor to the fully formed modern feather. Other dinosaurs were simply assumed to have feathers, and still other dinosaurs assumed to be part of the dinosaur-to-bird chain were found that had no feathers. Then when you really start to dig, you find out that Archaeopteryx had fully formed feathers, yet it's claimed to be older the grandfather, if you will, of the dinosaurs with protofeathers. So the evolutionary sequence is actually reversed. According to evolutionary interpretation of time and the fossil record, fully formed feathers de-evolved into protofeathers at the time of the dinosaurs. But how many of you viewers were aware of these facts? Research it yourself. I even wrote a brief article on my blog laying it out with references so you can start your own research. You can start to see why Alan reacted the way he did as he read what an expert on fossil birds had to say.
And he said that the fossil evidence for reptiles evolving into birds was based on nothing. There was no fossil evidence for the evolutionary proposition that reptiles evolved into birds. And I sat there for a moment and thought back to grade 7 when I'd asked my teacher a somewhat similar question about, well, do all the different kinds, are they all connected with fossil record? You know, and it was a very general question about, you know, the whole fossil record and nothing in particular. And the teacher said, well, yes, I think that's true. I don't think he was that sure, or he was being dishonest. But that's what the school system taught me. And I thought at that moment, when I read that, they've lied to me. They've lied to me. This is not what they say it is. And if it's real science, you don't need to lie about it. So I had to go back and think, this really isn't science. I've believed it because man has PhDs. But now I was learning that Jesus has his GOD, and that's better.
Okay, but you did say you struggled with the age of the Earth, though. So whatever became of that?
Well, yeah, it's one thing to sort of identify God as the agent that creates life, and that he's responsible for creating things individually as species and individually as human beings, and we're not connected except through God. That was a fairly easy point because, you know, if you read the scripture, it says very plainly that God created things after their own kind. And when I first read the Bible, my mind skipped over that. But when it comes to actually measuring the age of the earth, I mean, that's kind of like just mechanics, right? You measure a quantity and you measure a rate and you divide the quantity by the rate and you end up with time. And all the evidence I'd ever heard of dated the earth in millions and billions of years, and all the scientists who ever talked about the problem dated the earth in billions of years. So where was the evidence that the earth was young? And I argued with God, and I said, if, as you claim, the earth is really young, there's got to be evidence that the earth is really, really young. There's processes that are going on in the earth that, unless you've tampered with them, should give you a young earth. And God went silent on me. This is what happens sometimes when you argue with God from ignorance. God stops talking to you, and you don't want that. Christianity is about communion with God. When he stops talking, that's the end of your communion, right? So I ended up reading a book by Henry Morris called Scientific Creationism, in which he actually addressed that problem.
Dr. Morris's book.
Yep. So again, I went into the bookstore and I saw a book on scientific creationism, and the Spirit sort of led me to say, this is a book you need to read. And so I took it home and I started reading it, and lo and behold, wasn't in Dr. Henry Morris, you know, PhD, explaining various methodologies that you can use to date the earth, and you end up with all kinds of ages. It's not that your radiometric dating doesn't give you an old age, but that there's all kinds of other processes that are going on that give you a young age. For example, just look at the population problem. As someone who went into the actuarial profession, I'm aware of what demographics means and how you go about measuring that. 1 billion or 10 billion people is not a hard population to reach with the, you know, even for human beings, within 5,000 to 10,000 years. So why is the population of the Earth so small if the Earth is billions of years old? Becomes a problem. I mean, even if man's only been around for 1 million years, the population problem, or the size of the population, should be much bigger.
Now, Alan is a mathematician, so he would know. But let's examine exactly what it is he's saying. Our present population is around 6.5 billion people. Now, if we gave every single person on Earth 1 square meter, roughly a square yard, to stand in, it would take up a square area about the size of the state of Delaware. According to current evolutionary thinking, the first humans arose roughly 150,000 years ago. If we assume a very conservative population growth rate of 0.5% per year, within 150,000 years, starting with 1 couple, the population of Earth should be roughly 1.6 times 10 to the power of 325. That's 1.6 followed by 325 zeros. Notice this number is only for people. This ignores the alleged millions of years of hominid evolution before we even got to man. Even if we drastically reduce the population rate to a completely unrealistic figure of 0.1%, and assume Homo sapiens first arose around 25,000 years ago, we should still have somewhere around 1.5 times 10 to the power of 11 people.
Well, hadn't thought of that. The continents are eroding so that in 20 million years, all the rock on top that's above the ocean level would actually drain into the ocean. Well, how can the sedimentary rocks be 500 million years old if they are going to be eroded at, once every 20 million years? I mean, even if you kind of like cycle it, it means all the fossils from more than 20 million years ago should have disappeared, or at least the bulk of them. The salts in the ocean, they only take a few million years to build up, even if the ocean started as pure water. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I hadn't thought of a lot of things because they'd never been mentioned, because no one had brought them up, because science programs aren't gauged to deal with this question. They're only dishing out the answer the PhDs give, and the PhDs are all evolutionists, or bulk of them are, and that's what the media presents, is the majority opinion. So you never hear the other side. So you never dig down and actually get involved in the questions and the judgments that go into that whole question. And in fact, science really doesn't have enough information yet to tell you what the age of the Earth is, or even the sun. And even the astronomers admit, if we had to make the sun 6,000 years old, we could find a way to do it. But we just don't think it's right. We just don't think it's true. So we don't. And so the age question all of a sudden turned into a non-problem because science wasn't really strong enough to solve the problem. And I respect people who still think the age of the Earth is old, and I'm not particularly upset or angry at them, but they're really just rehearsing or repeating what other people have told them. They don't really understand all the data and all the problems. So they're speaking out of ignorance, which I did at one point too, so I forgive them.
Each of these men had a unique trigger for them that caused them to doubt evolution. In the case of Rick, it was roadkill. He combined his real-world observations and related those observations to his silent world. While Rick is exceptionally good at lip reading, I interviewed Rick with the help of his wife, who kindly translated for me.
Jag vill inte penstet.